Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour and buenos dias. Well, again, another welcome to basically one of the highlights of Black History Month 2026. As you heard, my name is Sheroy Birchwood, and I would be the moderator for today's event. First, let's start by making some acknowledgements. As I sit on the banks of the Chippewa River currently, I acknowledge that I am working and living in the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples, covered by the Dish and One Spoon Wampum and the Upper Canada Treaties. We offer our respect and our promise to be good stewards of this land as you were for thousands of years. I also recognize that I'm living and working in one of the final termini of the Underground Railroad of the 1850s. This area was a safe haven for hundreds of formerly enslaved people seeking refuge in Canada. This is the home base for Harriet Tubman. We express our thanks to her and to all our ancestors, both living and beyond, for the life and hope that they have procured for us. Okay, so as Linda mentioned, the procedures for today would be first we are going to have Dr. Williams are going to provide us with a presentation, followed by opportunities for us to ask her questions. So again, please free to use the chat box for questions. I will monitor the chat box for these questions. And also you may raise your hands or use the raise hand function. And that would also be a good way to ask questions. Now some introductions. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Wendi Williams, the president of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Williams is a scholar and a leader who is committed to social change. Her professional life ranges from academia to nonprofit work to many years of service within the APA, including leading important divisions. She's also the owner of WSW Consultation Services. And I think also personally, she has an interest in young people and in the development of young minds. She was also, and I'm proud to say this, the provost and senior vice president of Fielding Graduate University, which is one of my alma mater. The title of her presentation is Lead Well, Be Well, Actualizing Liberatory Leadership Praxis for Precarious Times. Her conversations will cover psychologists' roles as leaders and also an introduction of the Black woman's liberatory leadership praxis model. With pleasure, I hand it over to Dr. Williams.
Good afternoon, colleagues. It's really wonderful to be here with you. I guess I should say good morning, as some of you may be closer to the West Coast in a different time zone. But certainly an honor and a pleasure. And thank you for that very lovely welcome. So I'm Dr. Wendi Williams. I am the current president of the American Psychological Association. And beyond that, I am a scholar and a a student of history and also leadership. And so, a big piece of the work that I do, and largely what I'll share with you today, is a function of that commitment to those works. Um, and I would say to just how important it is for all of us to be thinking about our work in the field of psychology and our role as leaders. And so I also have some questions for you all too. So as we think about what that conversation looks like toward the end, I do want to hear from the group. So I guess we'll start there. Um, let's see, how do I, this always happens, but the technology doesn't. Let's see, there we go. So we'll go ahead and get started. One of the fundamental things for me as I prepared for our conversation was to not have a US centric view of the Black experience, which I can imagine is something that is probably a little hard to come by for Canadians and folks to the north. And so when I thought of, one, first we just need to celebrate. We're coming to the end of the Black History Month as penned by Carter G. Wills, Woodson, and that there are also and has been a long tradition of celebration of Black history and the diverse diasporic relationships across the globe of Black peoples and celebrating and amplifying life and culture and humanity in the space and the continued efforts and struggle to do so. So I asked myself, what is and did a little bit of study. How is Canada talking about Black history and Black History Month, and in what ways does that happen? And I found this quote from the Honorable Jean Augustine, where she says, Black history is not just for Black people, Black history is Canadian history. You wouldn't be surprised to know that we also south of the border in the United States talk about the fact that to know Black history is to know American history. So if that felt very resonant. And if we were to be even more expansive in our articulation, to know Black history is to understand the history of the Americas. And that is then conceiving of our relationship in and around and despite borders, which I think is important. So happy Black History Month to all of you. And I'm hoping that the month was wonderful and that you had opportunities of celebrating Black culture and humanity and presence, especially in times when it seems a little challenging to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So here's our agenda for the day. I am uh, partway through my welcome and introduction, and so we're almost ready to check that point off. I'd now and then we'll share then through what I call a threaded R story, as I think about myself as an American Black woman, an African American, and one who has been asked to lead the Association for Psychologists in the US, but also to speak with you as our fellow friends and colleagues north of us in Canada, and to think about what does it mean for us to think of this notion of Black history and our relationship with one another. And then we'll transition to a discussion or conversation around what does it mean to have a leadership praxis, a leadership way of being that is cultivated in precarity. Shay Roy talked about the one of the termini on the Underground Railroad, and it's one of the things that really stood out for me. This will be the first of two talks that I give to our Canadian colleagues this year. And just thinking about the relationship between us, the relationship between Black Americans, enslaved Black people in the US, and how finding freedom to the north and particularly crossing over the Canadian border made that possible. And so thinking that through feels important. I then want to introduce you to a model that I developed, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you and hearing your thoughts and your reactions to it. I call it the Black Women's Liberatory Leadership Praxis. It's a model that consists of 5 maneuvers and 3 mindsets. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Excuse me. And in the space of that as well, thinking through where does this notion of wellness live in our conversation? Because the title of this talk is, and we'll just go back for a second to so you can see that, because I think that it's critical here that in order to lead well, we have to be well, right? And that being well is so vital and necessary that we have a focus on our health and our wellness in order to be in these positions, to do them with care, not only for others, which is a primary point, but also for ourselves. And so I want to talk a little bit about that kind of configuration and the ways in which we embed wellness and the concept of leadership in the world, and especially in times like this, in times like now. And then we'll open it up for conversation. So I'm expecting it to be lively and engaging. I welcome your questions and also just your thoughts and comments too as you are reacting and responding to some of the material that we'll present. Above all, I'm a learner and I love to be in conversation and to learn from others that I'm in relationship with. So I'm hopeful that we will transition the focus on from me as speaker to us being in community and in conversation together. But with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So, when I thought about this work, and again, speaking with you all today, it made me so conscientious of the ways that perhaps probably no more closely that US and Canadian African Americans or Black people may share an experience, unlike others across the diaspora, because of this positionality in North America. And, in doing just the review, whether it's talking about segregation in educational spaces, in the context of business, in the context of housing or labor, that this idea of separating people across and because of their race and across racial lines is certainly a story that is shared. When I was engaged in reviewing and really thinking about our relationship to one another, it doesn't surprise me that in the US, the experience of race and racism and the experiences of Black people have in some ways can in some ways eclipse or overshadow the experience of race and racism in Canada. And I think fundamentally, through some of that conversation, it is, that there are steps to which we did see those segregations in Canada and across the border. And at the same time, there's this sort of strange sort of welcome where we see that there's also one of, as Dr. Birchwood spoke to, the strange welcome across the border in terms of escaping enslavement, escaping Jim Crow South laws and Black codes and some of those things in the US. But it's not to suggest that there were not these strong observances across the color line within Canada. And so there's just something for us to navigate and to manage in that regard. I also, when we talk about this threaded history, it's important for us to think about then, well, then who is the immigrant in Canada? The immigrant in Canada oftentimes were free and also Black people fleeing enslavement because the conditions of life and living were such that they may have been perceived to be not as bad as from where folks were coming. But it's also folks coming from the continent of Africa across the diaspora, as well as the Caribbean as well. When we think about the transatlantic slave trade and sort of the sort of travel and passage of African descendant people. So when you think about the diversity of the Black experience in Canada, there really is this presentation and this notion of this is the place to go, particularly to start a life and live a life. And at the same time, I think that as one might suggest that this can be seen as a bit of an ambivalent welcome. The race story in Canada is often, as we've said before, may experience this relationship with the US. And I think that this happens often with politics in the US, is that they're a bit overshadowing even for the globe at times. And so internationally, a global, we have to sort of, I think, have a more expansive and inclusive view of what the experience is of colleagues. The US was internationally a global example of how to separate and devastate a people according to racial lines. But that the example in the US was one that even the Nazis of Germany couldn't find it in themselves to replicate in that country. And so it's really interesting when we think about the miscegenation laws and the Jim Crow South laws that occurred, that even in Germany, where we often say those were the worst of the conditions on the globe, that there were conditions in the south of the U.S. that they found were even too harsh or too disgusting. And yet, with borders open to the diaspora of Africans, those trafficked through the Americas, the Caribbean, and the United States, the generosity of the Canadian border and of Canada also had its limits. I pulled this content. It comes from in 1911, beneath the leadership of Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier. The following was espoused. Canada was reacting and acting to restrict immigration by Black persons specifically. And this was a policy that was formalized at that time. And he wrote that His Excellency in Council, in virtue of the provisions of subsection C of Section 38 of the Immigration Act, is pleased to order, and it is hereby ordered as follows: for a period of 1 year from and after the date of the landing in Canada shall be, and the same is prohibited of any immigrants belonging to the Negro race. And so this is this kind of interesting dichotomy, right? That on the one hand, here is an open border receiving folks who are enslaved, receiving folks from across the diaspora, and at the same time, this restriction, an ambivalent welcome, an ambivalent welcome. Um, I think it's important for us to sit with that, and I think that this is why we must remember and honor and remember our story. Be it the backlash of DEI or the ongoing efforts to undermine and undercut the presence and accomplishments of Black people north or south of the Canadian border, US Canadian border, or all across the globe, it's important to remember and honor our stories and who we are. Who we are is a threat. Our existence in mere uh, our existence, because we continue to live and to thrive, is seen and can be seen as evidence of failed attempts to dismember Black people from their brilliance and their beauty. But I think that that is even more so why we must remember that you and me and us and we and all of us, that we must remember who we are, but also whose we are. We come from a long legacy of individuals and of groups who have partnered and did incredible work to ensure that we have presence here, that we actually live a life and have access to a life worthy of some level of living. And we live in times that, though the material realities and circumstances might have been different, that our ancestors would have recognized as still being uh, unpredictable, full of possibility, and requiring their sustained effort and focus to ensure that you and me would have these opportunities. And we do. We do have a lot of opportunities. And because of that, we live in times that can be navigated well by the wisdom and their past practice. Collectively, we live amid economic precarity, political polarization, climate instability, and rapid technological disruption that leads to widespread uncertainty, and leads to many of us wondering where we fit into this entire story. And this is the context of our leadership. So our ancestors, they did craft those leadership trajectories and stories within the context of precarity, not belonging, being told you can only come for a little while or that others can't follow you. Uh, and also the lived reality and experience within the contours of those relationships. If every day you're navigating the degree to which you belong and can have access to the full breadth of the human experience, you're living then every day with a little bit of stress, a little bit of worry and containment of that rejection. We have in this moment a space and an opportunity to gather in and around ourselves. And this is, I would say, the context in which Black women have cultivated their leadership praxis and is the undergirding frame from which I have crafted the Black Women's Liberatory Leadership Praxis model. So I'll transition now to talking a bit with you about um, this model, explicating it a bit, pulling out the details, talking it through. I'll share bits of its origin story with you, my own inspiration for developing this work, and the history and contemporary influences that brought me to the framework in the first place. We'll then engage the model specifically and discuss its aspects, particularly the mindsets and maneuvers that I spoke with you about earlier, and then we'll talk with one another for a bit. So often I'm asked, where did this come from? What inspired you to do this work? And I have to be honest, it was fear. It was fear. I decided to work on this model in 2016. It was the height of calls for the world to hashtag listen to Black women and highlighting Black girl magic, or there was also the hashtag let Black women lead. I'm putting up air quotes because what I was afraid of was this romanticization about Black women and girls and this sort of glorification of us. Um, and I did feel that that was occurring beneath a gaze of a society that really did not take us very seriously. And I worried that if we did not have a solid and substantive sort of framework to think about these ideas, that they could easily blow in the wind, that they could easily come and go as most fads do. And we've seen this happen already. I think many of you all can think of in terms of various social justice movements and the ways in which it was, they've been popularized and that folks then kind of get on board and they're excited about that kind of thing. And then there's silence and it's quiet once it's not as popular to say post on social media or wherever those things are going. And so as with all fads, I knew could this idea of this glorification of Black women and girls in our leadership and our magic, that it could and would fade away, and it did. In fact, and I don't know the numbers in Canada right now, but I can tell you that in the U.S. We are experiencing a significant Black backlash against Black women, in particular in the space in the world of work. Over 600,000 Black women are unemployed in the current economy right now. I won't begin to go into the economic impact of that on the gross domestic product or just the impact on families and homes and communities. But we have seen such a backlash. So, all the leadership positions, all the advancement, while there still are folks in key spaces and areas, the overall impact is this kind of pushback and backlash. And so, for that reason, I wanted something of substance to remain when public's interest waned, when perhaps some of the envy for what would ultimately be a brief moment of recognition for Black women would pass. And it did pass. I wanted something of value that explained Black women to Black women, especially once the attention moved on, and especially because I knew that the attention would move on. I'm a child who was racially socialized. As and also gender socialized within the US. And so very direct and explicit messages and preparation from my family placed me in a position to know that this is popular now and it's likely going to pass, just because that's the nature of the thing here. And so I wanted that to be the case for us. I wanted Black women and the words that I would write, but also those who are in awe of Black women's leadership to have something real and substantive to lean on that was theoretically based and grounded in historical and lived experience. So there that is. I also would say too that not just lived experience, but evidence in the freedoms and outcomes that many of us, Black women and others, enjoy today because of that leadership. I showed a picture of Jean Augustine, for example, previously, and I know that in Canada that she's been pretty formidable in her time, and many others as well. And I wanted others who benefit from and often cite the leadership praxis of Black women through imitation of some of those strategies to know where they come from, specifically because we know that movements like the Civil Rights Movement or the Black Power movement or the Black Lives Matters movement that sort of got their start in the US but spread across the globe, that there's often this untold story, but more told in recent history of the women behind those movements that made them possible. And so oftentimes we're studying those movements, not realizing that we're studying Black women's liberatory movement and leadership practices. And so I wanted us in the citation of Again, folks replicating and mimicking some of those strategies to know that we are actually needing to cite many of the women behind those movements that made them possible. They were deeply informed by and possible because of the leadership praxis of women and femmes, Black women and femmes. And so to cite our work is also not only to say that those were good practices and that you're following them, but the women who developed them and crafted them. So by saying their names of those who are often overshadowed or not mentioned, uplifts the legacy, but also the strategy embedded in there. Hmm. One of the things that I think is important to highlight is that the precarity of our leadership, while it looks different, may not be experienced all that different from the past, especially from Black women whose leadership praxis and maneuvers and mindsets that I studied to understand how do you, in a world that traffics your body, steals your children and your partners, and psychologically, spiritually, and physically tortures you, and blames you when your life carries the tracks of harm from that abuse, and also blames you for not adjusting well. How do you lead in that space? Because that's the fundamental question of Black women's experiences in the Americas. This is the context within which Black women like Mary McLeod Bethune, pictured here, and people like you and I are tasked to forge a leadership strategy to continue the fight for human rights for all people. Now, her story very quickly was an American educator, philanthropist, humanitarian, womanist, and civil rights activist. She founded the National Council of Negro Women in 1935 and proceeded to establish the Afro-American Women's Journal, which was the flagship journal of that organization. But I thought a lot about how one comports themselves and puts themselves in the posture of leading anyway, despite all of that degradation. She wrote here, and I think her words are telling. She says, and this was in the inaugural of opening up the headquarters of the National Council of Negro Women. Women of all nationalities can come together without fear or hesitancy, secure in the knowledge that they meet as equals and as workers striving together. We can think together objectively and opportunely and coordinate for the greater benefit of mankind. I think similar to what she understood, and that we understand, that the fight for Black people's rights and humanity, which is fundamentally what we're uplifting every year when we celebrate Black History Month, was fundamentally linked to access to the full human rights of all people. That no one person could be left behind, no group of people could be left behind, because that creates a permission structure to harm everybody else. We know the famous poem that they came for this person, then they came for that person, then they came for me because there was no one else. Because the idea is that we can't forsake any of us in terms of the advocacy and the fighting for human rights for all people. Otherwise, we're all subject and vulnerable to being attacked. Lower on the hierarchy of care and respect, Mary McLeod Bethune, she knew that those placed above Black people and Black women on the racial, gender, and class societal hierarchies might not see the value of advocating for her rights outright, but that if she shared and if they shared a fate with her, perhaps she could get them to care about her and hers. Hers being her community, her people. She also knew that if she and those among her were only to fight for the rights of Black people, no one would listen because Black people in the Americas, and we just saw from again that quote from the stature in 1911, that there was not a value of Black people in Canada. In fact, there was this idea of limiting the number of Black people who could enter the borders because it was seen that they were not going to be able to adjust culturally or to the climate as it were described. So, as both a moral imperative and strategic priority, she found an interest convergence to strengthen the fight for social justice and human rights in the US and across the globe. And this is the context of the birth of the Black Women's Liberatory Leadership Praxis model that I developed. It's a praxis that is undergirded by a sincere value in the life and dignity of all people, and is born out of some of the most precarious contexts occurring at that time. And I love this model because as we are currently facing very precarious times within the country that I live in, but I would say across the globe, we're really grappling with a real shift in geopolitical dynamics, economic dynamics, our climate, et cetera. We need leadership that can actually handle the uncertainty that we're living through. And that is the leadership tradition of Black women because that has always been the experience of Black women here. So, through the careful study of the history of women like Mary McLeod Bethune, and there are others, as well as contemporary acolytes like Jean Augustine and those lesser known, I developed this model to sort of help situate well, what is exactly that they're doing that we're witnessing happen? And how might we then articulate those practices and also replicate them, even imitate them, in order that we can be strong leaders in those precarious moments? So, here's the model. The Black Women's Liberatory Leadership Praxis Model is a framework for organizing the necessary characteristics of leaders that are responsive to unprecedented precarious times with a vision of hope and possibility beyond which, given the current circumstances, they really have no logical reason to expect. That things should be fine or be okay. In this space, we dwell in the transformative power and hope of things not yet seen, but we still work toward them because we know that making a step every day is better than not moving at all. Be Well Praxis is grounded in a scholarly framework that distills the time tested leadership practices of Black women across generations into an accessible model for leaders seeking transformative alternatives to traditional power structures. And this approach offers pathways to leadership that prioritize human and environmental wellness while achieving meaningful outcomes moving beyond white supremacist, patriarchal, and imperialist paradigms. As I've told you before, Be Well consists of 5 maneuvers. They're in the outer circle here, and 3 mindsets in the center here um, that leaders can leverage to navigate leadership challenges and opportunities. The maneuvers are resourcefulness, complexified grit, undisputed dignity, transformational equity, and speculative innovation. And on the inside are the mindsets. We'll talk a little bit about those as well. And they are love, persistence, and resilient joy. So at this point, I'm just going to take you through each of the maneuvers and then each of the mindsets. And we'll see where we land there. The first maneuver is resourcefulness. Each of the maneuvers I highlight what they are, we give them definition, but we also think about some of the critical considerations. You know, in this sort of paradoxical experience of being intersectionally positioned in society, both valued and relied upon, but also devalued and harmed. There are ways in which some of the maneuvers and mindsets need to be moderated and mediated in such a way that they are that our focus on health and wellness is maintained and that we can think about the ways in which even unintentionally that we may be harmed. So when we think about resourcefulness, this is the capacity to identify, mobilize, and creatively deploy available resources to achieve collective goals within context of systemic scarcity. This praxis involves constraint-driven innovation and community-oriented problem solving, often emerging under crisis conditions. And so, a critical consideration for resourcefulness is to ensure that while we know that we can be in resource restricted contexts, that we don't want to valorize resourcefulness because it risks normalizing the inequitable distribution of resources at the first point, right? The reality is that we're dealing with restriction because there's not equity and resourcefulness implemented at the heart of the decision making at times. That means that some are balancing and working with less than they should, while others are working with more than they need. And so rather than valorizing that, we want to make sure that we are articulating that that is something that we must do within precarious contexts, but that we also must demand the structural transformation that would equalize or at least provide some equity for the context in which we're doing our work. The next maneuver is complexified grit. Now, this is the capacity to persist toward collective goals under suboptimal conditions while maintaining discernment about when persistence serves versus when it harms one's well being. This praxis involves tolerating ambiguity and transforming tension into innovation. I often think about complexified grit as sort of when your back is against the wall, there are some who have to create more space between them and that wall because their back has always been against the wall. And so they're their grit, they're figuring it out, they're making a way out of no way is another way that people frame that is coming from that place. Again, a critical consideration here in this framework is acknowledging that adversity does build adaptive capacity. It does. You strengthen certain muscles when you deal with hardships. We see that sometimes with our clients and even in some of the research around grit, but also resilience, and even post-traumatic resilience, for example. So we know that there is a framework for that, but at the same time, we do need to reject those narratives that individualize inequities that are structurally based and that also demand endless endurance without systemic change. Again, we do not want to place individuals on the receiving end of changing systemic and structural inequity. We often and always have to understand that while we may develop individual or even community based resilience in some of these contexts, that it is very much a focus that very much needs to center and focus on, well, why is this system like this in the first place? And what are we going to do to change that? So this brought me to you all may have seen this. This occurred this last fall. Ilhan Omar, she's on the other side of the border. She's in Minnesota, but shares the border with Canada. She's one of our congresswomen, and she was being introduced or interviewed by a journalist. His name is Don Lemon. You all might be familiar with him. And she, something had happened at the Congressional Black Caucus down here in the States, and someone tried to bully her. And she said, and I just thought her response was so like funny but kind of spot on. She says, "You can't really bully a black woman. We're just made different." And I thought, wait. We don't want to suggest that like people bullying us is like not harmful. It is very, very harmful. But what she was also getting at too was this idea of like, yeah, but I'm bullied all the time. So I also have developed a skin that can be a little thicker at times just so that I can function. She is certainly someone who's been able to do that pretty effectively and speaks up for herself and her communities and her constituents. And at the same time, um, she's still human, still very, very human, and definitely deserves kindness and softness as well. But I thought it was very interesting that she framed it in that way because there is a toughness that she also recognizes she has to implement and to actualize in order to be effective. And that is part of that leadership legacy and trajectory. The next maneuver is undisputed dignity. Undisputed dignity is the strategic cultivation of an impeccable public presence to counter systemic devaluation and expand future leadership access for marginalized groups. Again, you know, I have another American example, and I hope that that doesn't bother you all too much, but that is my cultural context. Uh, but I'm thinking about Kamala Harris when she ran for office. I think the first time, and you may remember her saying something along the lines of, I'll be the first, but I won't be the last." And so one of the things that she's thinking about is, I have to set such an example, and I will set such an example such that I will not be the reason that people disqualify other Black women, other Indian women, other Asian women, anybody. I won't be a reason that they'll say, well, she was unqualified, so she can't be the person to come through. She knew that she had to have this sort of impeccable public presence, but also just meet higher standards of meeting requirements and crossing that bar. This praxis involves maintaining composure under hostility while demonstrating unquestionable competence. And I'll tell you, whenever I present this model, this particular slide activates folks. So I'm really curious what y'all are thinking. And when we transition to questions and conversation, what do you think about this? Because on one hand, colleagues and friends have said, well, Wendi, like, what are you saying that we have to walk around being these perfect, Omitrons and like we can't have humanity. And that's not what I'm saying at all. But part of the duality of Black women's experiences in the world is that it just is the case that we are often navigating contexts of projections onto us of inhumanity, that we don't get that experience of the full human experience. And so we either complain about it and not move on or get anywhere with it, or we recognize, oh well, that's just kind of what that is right now. I don't need to personalize it to myself, but that is the context that I am in. And so if I want to be effective, how am I going to navigate and negotiate that? And that's a different conversation. But it is one that requires perhaps a higher level of social emotional resonance and regulation. And at the same time, it's another burden. And it is a burden. So the critical consideration here, and I think we've been sort of uplifting it throughout this conversation, or I have, as I'm the only one speaking right now, but we'll be in conversation later, is that demand for flawlessness places disproportionate emotional labor burden on those already facing structural barriers, requiring perfection as proof of belonging rather than addressing systems that question legitimacy in the first place. And I'll add that that's often happening while others alongside, even with whom they're competing or engaging, are able to show very flawed, very humane, even sometimes perhaps sometimes mediocre performance, and that's held alongside this sort of expression and high level performance of her work. So it simply is an unfair thing. I thought I'd share with you the words from Anna Julia Cooper. This is from her work. She was an anthropologist and sociologist. Her work, a book that she wrote, Voices, A Voice from the South, that she published in 1882. And the language of undisputed dignity comes from her. It's a language that she wrote in that text. She said, only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. You'll note that how she's describing this concept is very different than how folks take it, because she's saying that there's a dignity that is undisputed because she is a woman and is living a womanhood, but that it is in that quiet space where that can be honored. And when we think about that from a leadership context, leadership often happening in public and in relationship with others, sometimes in contexts that are hostile. That that's not a quiet space of undisputed dignity, but it's a place where the dignity cultivated and crafted in quiet is is made to perform in a public space, and therefore it really requires a strength and a healthy space from which it is garnered initially, that is personal and intimate and interior to that woman. Transformational equity is the next maneuver. This is the commitment to liberation strategies that center those experiencing compounded marginalization, recognizing that freedom achieved for the most marginalized ensures freedom for all. This praxis involves addressing interlocking systems of oppression simultaneously rather than hierarchically, and building solidarity across difference while maintaining accountability with communities. So one the critical consideration here is that, transformational equity is a way of thinking that is not waiting for a right time or the good moment. It's not incremental in its inclusion into unjust systems. It is actually very commanding and demanding of fundamental restructuring immediately. We're not going to coax or try to encourage people to their better angels. We are going to require and expect it right now, and that this that the living with any element or of inequality is one that we just have to have a clear line that that's not permissible. And so these are fast acting activities, and they require a lot of courage and bravery, because oftentimes systems, particularly when you're a woman, when you're a person of color, are okay with, may allow you to be in relationship and be in leadership so long as you allow some things to pass. But transformational equity actually requires that we don't allow any of that to pass, and that we speak up and that we say immediately that that is wrong and that we have to do something about that now. So I called up here, the women of the Combahee River Collective. This is them when they were much younger in the 1970s. Oftentimes when people are thinking of transformative equity, they're thinking of this statement. I'm thinking of this statement that the women of the Combahee River Collective wrote, which is that if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. So, certainly a work in progress all the time, because there are many systems of oppression to dismantle. But the notion here is that we are not complicit in any of them, that we are not abiding them or permitting them or being permissible to them, but that we are always actively engaging the inequity there and pressing for a more just and an equitable situation for everyone always. And that we don't let up on that. We never make anyone feel okay that there's one group over here or there that's not quite okay. We continue to problematize that and continue to push for the equitable experience. And finally, the last maneuver is speculative innovation. Speculative innovation is the capacity to envision and work toward possibilities that exceed the current material conditions, sustained by faith in unrealized futures despite systemic barriers to their achievement. This praxis involves creative reimagining paired with disciplined effort, transforming aspiration into tangible outcomes through persistence and adaptive strategy. This is the dream space. This is the space where we say, we don't have the conditions that we want right now, but what do we want? If we could have our druthers, if we could have the biggest, most beautiful, bountiful expression of abundance and equity and opportunity for all people, what does that look like? And then we work toward that. You know, they say you shoot for the moon, you might catch a few stars. This is this in articulation. You know, from where my ancestors come from, their imagining of me is so far from where they were. But someone had to dream and work toward a possibility of me for me to be here. The same is true for each of you. We're probably just one twinkle of an eye away from so many possibilities and opportunities. And when I think about my life in that way, when I think about your lives in that way, it actually frames how I think about every moment that each of us lives in as leaders. I believe everyone is a leader, by the way, but each of us lives in as leader, and the decision making and the ways in which we can craft our efforts in such a way to impact and have change and opportunity manifest in the future as well. So, the critical considerations here are that, when we celebrate outcomes as magical or just out of nowhere, we want to make sure that we're tethering that to the real and actual labor and risk and strategic navigation that is required to even dream like that and to imagine things in that way, let alone work toward them. I don't know about you, but I am a pretty I'm a leader who's very ambitious around goals that are around things that are good for people. And when systems and structures are so ground in into their focal point, when they're so hesitant and just immovable with what they've always done and what they're used to, this can be really hard and it irritates people. You have to be ready to be on the receiving hand of another's anger. Um, that is a lot of sacrifice. That is exhausting and tiring, but it is the right thing. So, what we don't want to do while we're lifting up, this idea of really dreaming forward, like what is it that we really want, what we deserve, what we need, what we imagine the world requires. We don't want to obscure both the individual effort and the systemic barriers that necessitate that very extraordinary work. And especially that it sometimes will come with very ordinary recognition or no recognition at all. Sometimes folks may even take for granted that you did all of that, that you made all of that possible. And they just don't quite have it in them to sort of say, thank you. So we have to grapple with that. And that's a very real reality for us. So I want to talk with you a little bit about our shadow side. I've been in leadership for a long time, and so I can tell you that, these are really nice ideas. These are wonderful ideas. The maneuvers are, I think, they're aspirational. They're ways that we can really put into context that help me to describe what I've witnessed and studied in the leadership legacy of Black women. Um, but they're also not to be taken for granted. Each of the maneuvers on their own can be executed in such a way that, if we are not careful, can lead to some of the critical considerations that I was naming through and talking about, which would actually be quite dysfunctional and harmful to the individual. So, I've devised or derived some warnings from our collective awareness about the dangers of hustle culture. I know y'all have heard of that, of the over reliance on and exploitation of labor by poor and minoritized folks and women and femmes, the concept of elite capture of social justice ideals and frameworks, such that they become digestible and co opted, that these critiques that are quite radical and transformational are co opted by those, the languages are co opted by those who are not also committed to the actual shifts and changes in the systems and structures that would create a deeper, more expansive sense of freedoms and liberation. And this notion of rushing to feel better, to feel good, or even resolved before the difficult transformational systems and relational work can occur. This language of spiritual bypassing by John Wellwood describes this notion of, utilizing spiritual beliefs and practices to avoid dealing with those unresolved emotional issues. And I would speak to also unresolved or even the unwillingness or failure to interact with and interconnect with, what does it mean to actually shift and change these dynamics so that the inequities that we're experiencing, the structural and systemic inequities that have an impact on individuals' lives, can be shaped and can be reshaped. This harm is often perpetuated by well-intentioned folks, and I name that, no matter your hue, your color, your creed, your gender, we each have the potential to do harm as well as to do incredible good, including those from marginalized communities ourselves. And so this paradox cuts really deep because good intentions, without being grounded in reflective practice, can reproduce the very harms that they claim to seek to prevent. So when our colleagues lead from aspiration rather than accountability, when they center their own moral positioning over substantive change, the damage is compounded by the betrayal of expectation, because when it is coming from someone who looks like you or me, someone whom individuals would perceive us to be someone who's on an equity or justice path, it is actually more harmful. That actually can be experienced as more harmful. So the assumption that shared identity or stated values guarantee safe action creates a particularly insidious vulnerability, and one where harm goes unchallenged because the perpetrator is presumed incapable of doing it. In common parlance, we hear the terminology of gaslighting. And this sometimes happens in social justice and equity spaces because, in fact, there's this play around that line. This dynamic doesn't merely fail to advance justice, it actively erodes trust, silences those hurt by would be allies, and entrenches the notion that performance of care substitutes for the difficult ongoing work of dismantling oppression and real care, real concern. The result is a landscape where the marginalized must not only contend with overt hostility, but also navigate a minefield of unexamined good intentions, perhaps the more dangerous terrain because it masquerades as solidarity. And again, this is what can make it much more harmful. And this is the context of the double thinking and navigating and the strategies that are derived to address the inherent toxicity of the context and that require that we center our wellness. So, um, you'll forgive me, but I have our next. Let me go back. I needed to introduce that a little bit differently. In terms of thinking about promoting our wellness. So this is a clip of me talking about wellness and this notion of how we buttress these ideas um, around, managing the relationships that can be so harmful, and also managing our participation and also perpetuation of some of that harm. So we'll play this and then I'll continue on.
I would get sick after the end of a cycle like that. So
Okay.
wanting to really make sure that we cultivate and create space for folks to really find the blessing in the rest, but also the wealth in the rest. There's a lot of goodness in you that you can't access when you're spun out like that. and you think you're accessing it, but your art, your creativity, your visions, your future, your ways of thinking about how to creatively solve problems or advance and further build on some of that abundance is fueled by being rested and having the full access to all your senses and possibilities and all your wisdom and knowledge that you know. That's what rest does for.
So it was funny because I have an active social media and a colleague who helps me with that. And that was the video that was on yesterday. And I thought, well, that's perfect because that's what we're saying. We're talking about cultivating our rest. And I would name that cultivating our rest and wellness allows us to access the mindsets that allow us to lead with the liberatory focus. That's wasn't the focus of that video, but it certainly is the focus of this conversation. And so we've identified three mindsets: love, persistence, and resilient joy, each again, and they operate in the center of the circle there. That I'll take us through, and we'll talk about critical considerations related to each. So, I find it so wonderful to talk about love as a power and a mindset that we think through and think about and have embedded in the context of our leadership. Love as a power is the deep relational commitment to community that fuels sustained engagement in justice work beyond individual gain or recognition. This mindset involves drawing on collective care as the energizing force for systemic change, prioritizing communal well being over ego, and maintaining focus through setbacks. And that is very wonderful. But when we think about being careful with this language, right, we don't want to manipulate this wonderful power. Love as a political praxis does transform abstract activism into accountable action rooted in tangible human needs. Yet it does risk being romanticized and romanticizing exhausting labor. Thus, love must be paired with boundaries that prevent exploitation and burnout. We don't want folks' love for a community or commitment to a cause, if you will, to undermine their ability to be to be seen as someone who has limits, who can't always be working or always engaging their time and effort in such a way that would deplete them. And so working in tandem with these ideals becomes really important. Persistence is the next mindset. This is the commitment to continue toward goals despite systemic resistance, dismissal, and attempts to or at silencing or containment. This mindset involves maintaining direction through adversity, refusing to internalize narratives of unworthiness, and speaking truth even when doing so invites consequence. So persistence also has its own critical considerations in that it does enable survival and progress within hostile systems, yet when we valorize relentless forward motion, it does risk normalizing the constant opposition that necessitates it. Thus, persistence must be accompanied by critique of the structures and systems that require that you must endure in that way in the first place. Again, we want to be mindful. I want to be mindful that as we're setting out some of the parameters, some of the mindsets that I've witnessed and observed and studied in Black women and their leadership praxis, that would also take into consideration that what they were persisting against was embedded in a robust white supremacist patriarchal context, and that it was that unfairness and those inequities that created the need to lead in this way. And then finally, joy. Joy is our final mindset. Resilient joy is the intentional cultivation of pleasure, of rest, and communal connection as both resistance to dehumanizing systems and restoration of individual and collective well being. This mindset involves reclaiming time and energy from exploitation, finding sustenance in cultural practices and relationships, and protecting sources of authentic delight. And I love this particular mindset, especially because when we are engaged in a joyful space with others, one that is completely and utterly feeding back into ourselves, bringing deep belly laughs to each of us, or however we find that joyful space, it is the most expansive, deep, but intimate way of decolonizing your experiences from the control of anybody else, because you genuinely have to find it funny for yourself. You genuinely have to enjoy it for yourself, and the joy is in you. Critical consideration here, because we know that in our social media and other spaces, we hear a lot of folks talking about, well, don't let them steal your joy, and joy this, enjoy that. And so, joy as resistance does challenge those systems that extract labor and deny humanity. Yet, risk if and when we're doing joy for others becoming another demand for productivity, that you're performing joy rather than genuine restoration. And so again, that's why I speak to the inward space of that, the interiority of it, the intimacy of what you truly find delightful, what you truly find enjoyable. That has very little to do with any person's observation or gaze upon you. Thus, resilient joy must be self determined and protected from the commodification of others. And so, there's so many things about and for us that are so deeply sacred, and we want to continue to keep them for ourselves. So I know that Dr. Birchwood has some questions for me. These are some questions that I have for you all, and I can put them in the chat. I'll do that as I transition from sharing the screen. But what are the contexts of precarity shaping your practice and or study of psychology right now? As I understand, we have a pretty diverse group of people in terms of stage of career, students to colleagues who have been in the field for some time. Um, how does that precarity shape your work? How can you lead from your current position? As you know, I have a bias. I believe that everyone is a leader. And so I'm wondering about that for you. And three, how do you imagine the field of psychology can be positively shaped by you cultivating a liberatory leadership praxis? So while these ideas, these concepts, the maneuvers and mindsets are drawn from my study of Black women and Black women's leadership across time, they are concepts that are very possibly can be embodied and engaged in the human experience, because Black women are human. So learning from them also is just attaching to and learning from a human experience that is accessible to all of us. So I want to thank you so much for your time and energy and attention. This has been very lovely. And now I will look forward to hearing from you. So I'll stop sharing and I'll put those questions in the chat as I promised.